This module is on assessing infants and toddlers. Although assessment can help caregivers understand the children they care for, it can be challenging to assess infants and toddlers, especially if you think about assessment as one-on-one testing interaction. Infants have very short attention spans, particularly if they are being asked to do something that does not interest them, and they express strong feelings if a toy they are happily playing with is removed. They are strongly affected by contextual factors. If the baby is hot, cold, tired, hungry, afraid, or just not interested, it is unlikely that you will get a valid assessment of his development. Infants and toddlers are still wholly dependent on parents. In addition, a child's developmental level and cultural background can affect how she approaches assessment tasks. For example, during periods of strain or anxiety, it will be difficult for an infant to interact easily with an unfamiliar adult. Additionally, because their limited language skills do not allow them to tell you what they know, you have to figure out nonverbal cues, vocalizations, and body language. Even when using less formal types of assessment, observing and assessing infants and toddlers in centers or on home visits can be a challenge. Infants and toddlers cannot be left to play independently, and simply finding time to observe and take notes requires a high degree of professional commitment, as well as efficient time management skills. Very young children require ongoing attention and assistance, which means that caregivers cannot observe out of the action, but must observe while they are interacting with the children. Moreover, because caregivers often carry infants and toddlers, taking notes is not always an option. In the complex and ever-changing environment of an infant-toddler program, it can be daunting to find the time and energy to make assessment an integral part of teaching. So, assessing infants and toddlers requires that you assess them in the context of relationships. These are relationships with adults, other children in their lives, and in the settings in which they are involved. Despite the many challenges posed by the developmental characteristics of infants and toddlers and the busy nature of infant-toddler programs, assessment of very young children is an essential part of quality care. Carefully and regularly observing infants and toddlers, followed by sensitive interpretation of their behavior within a developmental continuum, can provide benefits to infants, toddlers, and their caregivers. Assessing infants and toddlers helps caregivers build relationships with the children. The better you understand a child and take actions based on those understandings, the stronger your relationship with the child. Studying children, which is at the heart of assessment, helps teachers understand why children do what they do, what makes them smile and laugh, and what tasks are difficult for them. Caregivers gain respect for the children's strengths and challenges, feel connected to them, and come to appreciate each child's individuality. These social relationships provide the foundation for learning. Effective assessment also allows educators to describe and track children's development over time to ensure that children are growing and developing as expected. Typically, infants and toddlers grow and change at a rapid pace. If careful observational assessment reveals that a child is not progressing, the caregiver can seek further evaluation. When programs keep track of children's developmental progress, families can be reassured that their child is developing normally. If families have concerns about their children's development, they can share those concerns with a caregiver who has carefully monitored the child's progress. A major reason for regularly assessing infants and toddlers is to translate the assessment information into individualized plans for children. Too often, assessment is seen as outside of the caregiver's primary role, and potentially useful available assessment information sits unused. Uncovering infant strengths and areas of difficulty allows the caregiver to tailor interactions, routines, materials, and activities to each child's individual needs and interests. Assessing infants and toddlers can strengthen the relationship between the home and the program and can empower families. The caregiver who regularly shares information with families and listens appreciatively to each family's stories and comments is forging a relationship of equality with the families. Partnering with families to learn about children's development acknowledges that families have unique information to share and that their perspective is valued. When family members feel that they have something valuable to share with the program, they are more likely to become involved in a meaningful way. Assessment of very young children is a highly collaborative process with families. They know their children best and can often be key in unlocking the complex behaviors of young children. This actualized partnership requires direct family involvement in all phases of assessment. Some areas that can help you better understand the family and the child include the family's structure and composition, the family's daily routines and practices, strategies that are used for behavioral issues, family perception on disability, health, medical, and educational needs, and the language and communication styles of the family and family members. All of this data collected will help with evaluating the infant and toddler. As with assessing older children, there are several types of assessments, and it is possible that you may have a role in each of them. We will discuss 3 types. The first type is screening. Screening is a brief assessment procedure designed to identify children who should receive more intensive diagnosis or assessment. It is designed to help children who are at risk for health and developmental problems and or school failure to receive intervention services as early as possible. The rationale here is that early intervention services can prevent symptoms from becoming further entrenched and avoid more costly and potentially stigmatizing services. It is possible to do screening quickly and economically. It can be cost-effective in that it may reduce the need for complete evaluations of some children if the outcome of screening suggests that further evaluation is not needed. Screening procedures for infants and toddlers typically include multiple measures such as developmental status, general health, sensory system functioning, and behavioral characteristics, making sure to always consider context, particularly culture and language and socioeconomic status. The second type of assessment is diagnostic assessment. This occurs in response to concerns about the child that may center around these following areas. Developmental delays. A child may not be seen as developing at the same rate as siblings or other children in a care setting. The parent-child relationship problems. A parent may have concerns about being able to work effectively with the child, and or a child may appear to be out of control with frequent tantrums or might be seen as withdrawn. Eating and sleeping problems. They may also display issues related to daily activities. Those can involve eating, sleeping, or toileting. The purpose of these assessments is to develop a complete, comprehensive view of the child in context and to be able to use that information to facilitate the child's continued development. Although others would be very involved in the assessment process, your role likely would be to contribute, as a member of the assessment team, important information about the child in the setting in which you interact with him. Your input may be particularly important in light of the many potential issues with assessment measures for this age group. There are 3 primary issues related to assessment measures. First, there are a limited number of appropriate instruments that can be used with this population. Because there are so few, it is not unusual for practitioners to inappropriately use instruments. In other instances, some instruments that are designed for a specific age group or for children with specific characteristics are misused with children for whom the instrument was not developed. A test should be valid for the child being assessed and for the determined intent of the assessment. Secondly, some of the instruments used by practitioners with very young children lack information about their validity and reliability. Some measures that have not undergone any kind of norming procedures yield developmental age scores that are inappropriately used to determine eligibility. For an assessment tool to be considered for inclusion in the assessment battery, it should have been normed on a representative sample of children. It is incumbent upon the individual conducting the assessment to consider reliability and validity of instruments that may be selected for use to determine eligibility. Finally, the use of intelligence tests for infants and young children is inappropriate, as these tests have poor predictive validity. Patterns of development may vary considerably across children, and there is variability in these patterns for each child during their early years. Because of this, intelligence tests fail to do a reliable job of forecasting a child's cognitive abilities. Some practitioners continue to rely on these tools in spite of their limitations. For these reasons, the third type of assessment, ongoing assessment, often is a more reasonable approach to collecting information about the presence or absence of a problem. Ongoing assessment can be considered to be the first intervention in that it provides a mechanism to gather information systematically and to determine the conditions under which the behaviors of concerns occur. Ongoing assessment also provides parents and guardians an opportunity to provide information and become involved in arriving at an understanding of their child's situation. Artificially separating the child from family members in an assessment fails to account for their role in the child's development. Secondly, family members contribute important information about the child's typical behaviors, his or her strengths and weaknesses, approaches that may be more effective, and contexts that will promote optimum performance. This results in a more accurate picture of the child's developmental status that has more validity. Lastly, the assessment process often sets the stage for future interactions between early intervention practitioners and families. If they are actively engaged in the assessment process, they may feel that they are truly partners in the early intervention enterprise. Ongoing assessment is similar to the types of assessment we have discussed so far in this course. It is ongoing and looks for multiple sources of information from a variety of individuals and in a variety of settings. The information obtained can form the basis of a better understanding of and planning for the child. To conduct ongoing assessment of infants and toddlers, it is important to know and understand the sequences and timetables of development. This will help you gather the information in context and determine if issues exist. In an ongoing assessment, it is useful to identify both strengths and abilities as well as weaknesses that need to be strengthened. Finally, ongoing assessment should occur in familiar settings for the child. A strange or unfamiliar place is unlikely to result in good information. Context is all important when evaluating infants and toddlers. Here are some don'ts to keep in mind. Don't separate the child from the caregiver. Chances are you will not get good data. Don't have someone the child is unfamiliar with conduct the assessment. Don't limit the assessment to certain areas you want to get as full a range of information about the child's functioning as possible. Don't use formal tests as the cornerstone of evaluation. Remember that especially with very young children, a formal measure is only one piece of information, and that seeing the child in a variety of settings and interacting with a variety of individuals also will provide you with valuable information. Even more important are the do's of assessment. Do begin with conversation. You should never jump into an assessment with either parents or the child without taking time for both to get comfortable. Do listen to what parents tell you. If the information is very different from what you have observed, this does not mean that it is untrue. Rather, it may mean that the factors in play may be different, and therefore the child may react differently to the unique configuration of variables in play. Do observe in a familiar setting. This will enable you to obtain a more realistic sample of behavior. Do allow parents to observe. You can have a conversation with parents and determine if what was observed is typical or not of what may occur at home. Do assess specific areas as necessary. You may want to focus in on areas of concern. As mentioned earlier, use multiple sources of information. The goal for any infant or toddler assessment is to elicit the child's best performance. There must be attention to the process and the end product. Be prepared to make subtle adjustments as needed throughout the course of the assessment. There are several ways to adjust assessments to best meet the needs of the child and still gather important information. First, break down an assessment activity into a sequence of steps and document the successful completion of each step. Or you can add or subtract sensory information and document the effect of doing so. Be comfortable with trial and error and alternate methods for achieving success. Lastly, provide visual, auditory, and physical prompts to facilitate success. You also can try to teach the child learning strategies and document the child's response. For example, how does the child respond to praise and positive feedback? Is the child able to imitate your actions when you, another child, or a family member models responses? Does the child do better when provided with frequent rest breaks? Try providing learning strategies within the context of the child's interests and desires. How does the child do when provided the opportunity to practice and have repetition? Finally, does the child benefit from either visual and/or auditory cues? One way to examine the child is to look at areas of development. One measure, the ounce scale, is organized around 8 age levels and 6 areas of development. These 6 areas provide a way to organize observations and data. They are personal connections, how children show trust; feelings about self, how children express who they are; relationships with other children, how children act around other children; understanding and communicating, how children understand and communicate; exploration and problem solving, how children explore and figure things out; movement and coordination, how children move their bodies and use their hands. These areas of development provide the framework for the caregivers and families' observation of the child. In making sense of the data, it is important to look at the child's developmental skills, temperamental characteristics, coping styles, namely how the child appears emotionally, whether or not she tries to find solutions in a developmentally appropriate way, if the child becomes easily overstimulated or needs a great deal of stimulation to move forward, if the child engages easily or is avoidant. It also is important to examine the range and intensity of moods and behaviors alone, with caregivers, siblings, other adults, and with other children. Finally, because of what the child does as is in relation to others, there should be an effort to summarize the caregiver's capacities. However, keep in mind that this latter point typically is done by an assessment specialist. Keep in mind cultural context can play into the gathering of assessment data. What is the context of the testing situation compared to the context of the child's usual interactions in his home? When discussing assessment results and intervention plans for children, it is important to provide practical help for families. Take advantage of strengths and encourage families to build upon those strengths. Provide information, advice, and translate infant signals. Tell them what it means when the child does X. Plan to provide emotional support for families if needed, and help with behavioral techniques that families can use at home. An infant or toddler with a disability includes those who are experiencing developmental delays, have been diagnosed with a condition that has a high probability of developmental delay, or is labeled at risk by other program definitions. At times, and with certain programs, an individual family service plan will be created. These are similar to a student's individualized education plan, IEP, in that it specifies ways to address identified needs. It is different in that it recognizes the unique role of the family, identifies family strengths, and identifies needs that will be important to address in order to bring about the desired change for the child. It also can specify the specific services and coordinate activities that are needed. These can involve services to the family as well as the child. As you can see, assessment with infants and toddlers uses many of the techniques we already have covered. In particular, your observation skills and systematic documentation is critical when working with this age group. Your knowledge of development is critical, as is the active participation of the family in this process.